The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess is a bit of an outlier in the Zelda series in that it doesn't do much to distinguish itself like the other games. Because the Zelda games are so similar to one another in terms of gameplay and structure, it's the unique details that each game brings to the table which makes them notable. Ocarina of Time had the time travel, Majora's Mask had the 3-day limit and the mask transformations, Link to the Past had the Dark World, Wind Waker had the ocean and the cartoony art style, and so on. Twilight Princess lets you turn into a wolf. It's not a terrible idea, but it's not really utilized in a way that makes Twilight Princess feel truly unique. Near the end of the game, the wolf form is basically only used once per dungeon. Even in the very last dungeon in the game, the wolf form is used as punishment for walking into cordoned off areas. It's a sad conclusion for a feature that could have been far more interesting. But I get ahead of myself. We should start from the beginning. In doing so, I want to look at Twilight Princess's biggest flaw in my opinion, and the flaw that kept me from playing this game until almost 10 years after its release, due to a terrible experience my first time through. And that would be pacing. Used in a sentence, Twilight Princess is a video game with really bad pacing. The game begins, as per tradition, in a hick village out in the middle of nowhere. After a short introduction, you take control of Link in his farmhand incarnation. I appreciate the game's efforts to establish Link as an actual character in the world, but those efforts end up stretching out the tutorial section of the game past the 2-hour mark. You herd goats twice, you throw hawks at babies, you learn how to fish so that you can spend the rest of the game not fishing. None of it's awful from a gameplay perspective, but you spend the first major expanse of the game waiting for something to happen. You can also see here that the camera controls in the GameCube version are inverted horizontally with no option to reverse them. There's no excuse, Nintendo. This tutorial section also introduces this forgotten Dr. Seuss character, Ilya. She'll come to play a larger and more frustrating role in the story, but for now she's basically just your Epona tutorial node. It's great that Epona is introduced so early in the game, as she's such an iconic part of the Zelda franchise and makes travel feel much quicker during this otherwise laborious stage of the game, even if her main use here is to herd goats, twice. So after the goats are all herded, it's back to Hicksville for some minor puzzle solving. The rate at which everything happens during this section is incredibly frustrating. For example, you need to use a hawk to fetch distant objects. To use the hawk, you have to slowly climb up a pillar, jump across more pillars, pick up a weed, blow into the weed, watch a cutscene of the hawk slowly circling the player, aim the hawk, throw the hawk, and then watch a cutscene of the hawk flying over to the object, grabbing the object, and returning with the object. God help you if you don't aim correctly. Once you return the baby to the mother, you get to watch her sprint across the area. Then you throw a goat, wrangle a cat, and terrorize an old man. Eventually, you get a slingshot and a wooden sword, and the game can truly begin. But first, you have to go through separate slingshot and wooden sword tutorials, where they laboriously explain that you can attack in different ways by moving differently. I know it's important for everyone to have the basic controls down before they get thrown into a combat situation, but the combat in Twilight Princess really isn't that deep. Everything that is explained in the tutorial, minus L targeting perhaps, will quickly become obvious to anyone who plays this game for a while. At the very least, there should have been an option to skip this entire section. So, then the kids, who I somehow didn't hate at this point even though they were the ones putting me through all these tutorials, run off into the nearby forest because a monkey in a hat shows up, and you get to go save them. Once you head back home and herd some more goats, you get the sense that the game is finally about to begin. The forest temple looms, you're armed and ready, and things are going okay. Pacing problems? What pacing problems? But then these guys show up and steal your girl. But then Tron shows up and steals your humanness. This scene reveals something that I want to talk about, the Triforce. I think the Triforce is dumb. It's a lame plot device that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It's basically a justification for Ganondorf to keep coming back and fighting Link and Zelda, but it's not really explained in the games or made to feel important. Basically, these three people keep being born and they keep having glowing triangles on their hands so they can keep fighting and Link always wins. There's no mystery or intrigue to it. It's just basically in these games because they're Zelda games. Okay, sorry, wolf time. So, you get kidnapped as a wolfman and taken to Hyrule Castle, but this is not the Hyrule Castle you know. This is also our introduction to Midna, who stands as possibly the single best part of Twilight Princess. In terms of character growth, I don't think the Zelda series has ever had a character as likable or as interesting as Midna. Her design also shows off the strengths of the glowing, arcane Twilight art style. So, after she busts you from the prison, the two of you escape from the castle. Here, again, slow pacing rears its ugly head. Rather than an exciting prison escape, you spend your first time in Twilight Town slogging through a sewer. The bane of video games, and this is how they show off Wolf Link. This key design decision turns this otherwise important part of the game into a chore. If you can stay awake long enough to make it through, you get a nice little cutscene which builds on Midna's character and introduces Zelda. We also get a glimpse of the game's main antagonist, Xant. Xant's character has some problems later on. Here though, he's a very effective villain. He's imposing, mysterious, and powerful. His design is bizarre in the best way possible, and he seems like a force to be reckoned with. If pacing is my main issue with the game, the characters are one of the aspects I think Twilight Princess does best. So, once you get caught back into Hyrule as we know it, you meet your first spirit. This is where the game's pacing completely falls apart. The game has been introducing itself for hours now, but it withholds the first dungeon still and hides it behind one of the worst gameplay sections of any Zelda game I've ever played. Before you can progress, you have to collect light orbs from bugs. Bugs that only Wolf Link can see. As such, the next 10 to 20 minutes is spent wandering around an area you've already been in and attacking bugs. This section is made worse by the fact that you don't go about this in any special way. There's no secret method to dispatching the bugs, you just attack them like you would any other enemy. They're marked on your map, so there's no real challenge to the exploration. You don't have to hunt them down. You even have to wait for the light orbs to slowly drift to wolf level once you pop them out of the bugs. This entire section is a complete mess, and I have no idea why it's in the game other than to make it longer. That you have to do this 2 more times is insulting. If you can make it through all that, you get to experience the next major roadblock. On your way to the Forest Temple, you encounter an area covered in poisonous fog. This area confounds me. You're given a lamp to use to dispel the fog, but a monkey comes along and steals it from you. So now you have to tail this monkey who does exactly what you would have done, except she moves slower and takes a meandering route through this area. If this was intended to show the player that they can dispel the fog, then it's the most roundabout way of doing this I can think of. This is the last major hang-up for me in this section of the game. It's about at this point where I quit playing my first time through. Finally, the Forest Temple begins. This is a good thing, as the dungeons in Twilight Princess are generally very well designed and fun. I'd go so far as to say that Twilight Princess has some of the best dungeons in the series. The Forest Temple is maybe not one of those, but it's a great introduction to the dungeon format for new players. The monkeys who have been harassing you are used as navigational tools as they beckon you towards new areas you should be exploring. They can also help you across gaps, and the main goal of the dungeon becomes creating a lengthy monkey chain outside the boss area. One thing I think this dungeon does especially well is enemy design. The Skulltulas are menacing and creepy like giant spiders should be, and one of the rooms features these tile worms, which are one of my favorite enemies in the series. It's especially fun to come back through this area with the boomerang and mess their day up roaring. This dungeon also introduces Uku, which I won't talk about right now. Just keep this guy in the back of your mind, I'll come back to it. So after a well-designed but simple boss, you receive your first MacGuffin and are sent east to Kakariko Village. This is the player's first introduction to Hyrule Field, but what first seems like an expansive area to explore is eventually revealed to be an expansive area with not much to explore, and lots of ground to cover and recover. It's like they took the Ocarina of Time Hyrule Field, multiplied it by 4, and called it a day. It's made even worse by the fact that you can't summon Epona at will, and you have to use these specific plants to call her. I assume this was done to get you to use wolf form more, but instead it just feels like yet another bizarre pacing problem. So after you warp in a bridge, you find the missing kids and get to do another light bug section. This one is slightly more interesting in that you get to venture inside Kakariko Village's various shops and homes, but it's still the worst thing humanly possible. With that taken care of, it's on to the Goron Mines. But first, one of my favorite sections in the game. I never expected a Zelda game to involve a sumo wrestling simulator, but I'm so glad it exists. It's a great change of pace and a lot of fun. This also leads into one of the best thematic moments in the game. A band of orcs roll through town and Link is pissed. This whole sequence is fantastic and it ends in a jousting match that was so good it earned its own Smash Brothers stage. This is where I started to get over some of my gripes with the game. After proving your worth to the Gorons through the art of sumo, it's Mines times. This dungeon introduces the iron boots, which can be used to walk along magnetized surfaces. It's a fantastic idea for making the boots more interesting, but the pace at which you walk is so slow that it loses all novelty extremely quickly. You also get the bow, which, at least in the GameCube version, is somewhat difficult to aim due to the lack of any kind of reticle. Otherwise, this is a fun dungeon which has you assembling the boss key in parts. This idea is used well. Talking to the Goron elders throughout the area gives the experience a much needed boost in personality, and it makes it feel like you're making progress the entire time. The boss is also extremely memorable in an aesthetic sense, if maybe not in a gameplay sense. From there, you visit Castle Town for the first time. I love what they did with Castle Town in this game. It hustles and bustles like a real city. I just wish it wasn't split up by so many loading screens. You're introduced to the Zora Prince, who is a complete waste of a character. He doesn't really have a personality, and his arc is basically he's sick, he gets better, he's sad his mom's dead. I don't remember what his name is, and I really don't care. After some more bug hunting, the game throws one of the coolest and strangest video game cutscenes I've ever seen into the mix. It's like if David Lynch got to direct a Zelda origin story with no real idea what a video game is. It's absolutely fantastic. Here it is in full. After that highlight, you get to play through one of the worst sections in the game. Remember those pacing issues I was talking about? Well, here the game piles on an escort quest after a bug hunting session. It's basically daring you to stop playing at this point, especially given how little motivation there is to help the Zoras. After how well I thought the Goron stuff was handled, this feels like a complete reversal. It also left me with very little health, which meant that the beautiful and actually very touching cutscene that follows this section was interrupted by my heart meter beeping at me constantly. I did not have a lot of love for the game at this point. Finally, the Water Temple. This isn't a great dungeon. It relies on the same tricks that the Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask water temples relied on. It's really not that memorable, and I don't have much to say about it. You divert water, and then the temple fills up. The boss is done. Next. So now that you have all the MacGuffins, your MacGuffins turn into mirror guffins, but first you have to escort Midna back to Castle Town. This section is one of the most memorable and beautiful in the game, with heavy rain falling and a somber piano melody playing. The only thing that breaks it is that the enemy combat music drifts in every time you get close to an enemy. It's extremely distracting, especially because the combat music clashes so much with the mood the game is trying to create here. After that, it's Master Sword time, and then it's Gerudo Desert time. But the dungeon here is one of my favorites. It has a real Indiana Jones vibe to it, with lots of swarming beetles and quicksand and malevolent spirits. The item you get here, the spinner, is a fantastic idea that makes for some really cool and enjoyable puzzles. The boss fight especially makes good on the promise of such a non-Zelda-y item. And overall, this is probably my favorite dungeon in the game. Is this because it cribs extremely heavily from my favorite Ocarina of Time dungeon? That's for you to decide. This dungeon ends with another great cutscene. It introduces Ganondorf and makes him seem far more powerful and dangerous than he has in the past. The cutscenes in Zelda games aren't mentioned much, but I think they all do a great job with mood and cinematography. In this game especially, the cutscenes are almost exclusively a blast to watch. The next dungeon is a great one, but it falls into the same trap the other dungeons have fallen into. It's like they designed the dungeons in this game first, realized it wasn't enough for a full game, and then tried to come up with the worst possible ideas for how to fill the time in between. In this case, you have to go to Kakariko Village, talk to the Zora Prince, get his earring, use it to go fishing, turn into Wolf Link, smell the fish, and then use the scent from the fish to navigate a snowstorm. It's not the worst section of the game, but it feels like pointless, arbitrary busy work. It doesn't help that it's capped off by a snowboarding section. Snowboarding section. Snowboarding section. But then the dungeon is so rad. It's a sleepy old mansion out in the mountains, occupied by a Yeti and his wife. And as you go through, you inadvertently gather these ingredients for the Yeti's stew. And at the end, he uses that stew to revitalize his wife. And the whole idea is fantastic. It really does feel like this creaky old frozen over mansion. You also get a giant ball and chain, which is a ton of fun to use. And it's probably a cute little nod to the Yetis, but I can't tell. The boss fight against the possessed Lady Yeti is also a great time, and the cute little cutscene that follows is the best resolution to a boss fight I've ever seen. At this point, I was in love with this game. Next up, Temple of Time. This is an interesting dungeon, in that you spend the first half progressing through it in a linear fashion, and then you spend the second half moving back out with this giant statue buddy. And luckily, the giant statue buddy can bust through most obstacles, so whereas the first half you're kind of puzzling your way through, the second half you just roam back out with this guy crashing through every barrier, and it's a great time. From there, it's on to my least favorite dungeon in the game. But first, remember Dr. Seuss Girl. She knows how to get into the city in the sky you need to go to, or something. So you have to go to this lost city and do a Wild West shootout. And then an old lady gives you a talisman, and you take that talisman back to the Cat in the Hat, and she remembers that the old lady knows stuff. So you go back to the old lady, and she gives you a book, and then you have to go all over the map and move statues off of pedestals, and then walk onto the pedestals. And there's like 8 of them, and then all the statues are marked on the map, so you don't really have to go find them. And you can warp anywhere, so you just kind of have to warp to the points and then move the statues. And so this is basically just fast travel sequences interrupted by mild statue moving. And it's the worst part in the game, and let's not talk about this anymore. So yeah, the city in the sky. It sucks. Remember those Uku dudes? It turns out they're the Forerunners from Halo, and they live in a giant, perilous floating city, despite being a foot tall and possessing unique little bird bodies. And that's the end of their storyline. So yeah, were you wondering what those bird people were? They're old bird people. Moving on. The dungeon itself is entirely dependent on its item, the dual claw shot. And what this means is that you spend the entire dungeon shooting at claw shot targets, and then looking around for other claw shot targets to target. I guess I'm just glad they concentrated all the bad dungeon design here so that the other dungeons could shine brighter. The boss is extremely easy, but it's an interesting idea, and the boss arena feels moody and unique. I don't think I'd ever replay Twilight Princess knowing I'd have to play this section again. From there on out, though, the game starts charging ahead at full speed. You travel to the Twilight Zone, and it's a great, simple dungeon that focuses on escorting a glowing sphere from one end to the other. And this sounds simple in practice, but in a stroke of genius, they sick a wall master after you the entire time. And wall masters have always been the most stressful parts of Zelda games for me, and this new twist on their concept is a great way to give this section a sense of urgency. I love the way this place looks also. It combines futuristic with retro details, and it feels as alien and strange as a Twilight realm should. Unfortunately, a lot of my goodwill got thrown out the window once I got to the boss fight. Our helmeted friend Zant had stayed out of the limelight until now, and that gives his character a mystery and foreboding that worked extremely well. I was not looking forward to fighting this guy and Ganondorf in the same game. But then he takes off his helmet and everything goes to pot. He starts throwing a tantrum and acting like a cartoon character, and all sense of dread or danger go completely out the window. Based on the musical cues, it seems like we are supposed to take this as his psyche finally snapping, but it feels more like a 5-year-old throwing a hissy fit. It doesn't help that this boss fight recycles areas and concepts from the other bosses in the game, which leaves you with only a fairly simple sword fight at the end as a reward for your time. But with everything else completed, all that's left is to face Ganondorf. The trip through Hyrule Castle is a bit more frustrating than it should be due to a puzzle I solved in the wrong way, using a much more clever solution than what they expect of you. There's also this necessary area whose entrance is way too well hidden, but despite all those qualms, the mini dungeon here culminates in a series of sword fights that really showcase how fluid and fun the combat can be in the 3D Zelda games. The only downside here is that the optional sword techniques that you could pick up along the way really trivialize the challenge. Even the toughest enemies can be defeated by rolling behind them repeatedly and stabbing them 3 or 4 times, then repeating. You certainly don't have to do so, and players looking to challenge themselves can bypass that whole system entirely, so it's not a huge deal. I just felt it made this whole section a little too easy. And then the final boss is split into 4 sections, but the one that matters is the final one. After defeating Ganon in his possessed demon and horseman forms, you go toe-to-toe in a fenced-off arena with only your sword to help you. This is an amazing last boss fight because it doesn't rely on any gimmicks of any kind. It's just you and the greatest threat Hyrule has ever seen, clashing swords in the middle of the field. It's awesome. When the final blow is struck, the game shifts into one of the best and most emotionally affecting credit sequences I've ever seen in a video game. I haven't talked about it much, but Midna really comes into her own over the course of the story. She starts off pretty bratish, but there's a noticeable mutual respect that develops between her and Link over the course of the story as they fight together and as Midna's backstory fills in. To see her in full splendor, only for her to vanish from the world forever, is the kind of bittersweet ending that few games could pull off this well and this confidently. It's a testament to Midna's character that it works perfectly. And that, my friends, is Twilight Princess. It's a great game with a fair share of issues, mostly relating to pace outside dungeons. But wait, off in the distance, the greatest threat of them all. Rupee chests! So, let's say you're in a dungeon, right? And you got a full wallet. You got 600 rupees or 300 rupees. Your compass tells you there's a chest in the room, even though you've already solved the main puzzle. You need a small key to unlock the next dungeon door. After much searching, you figure out what you need to do to get to that last chest. Anticipation builds. You slowly open the lid. Light streams out. You got 10 rupees! Your wallet's full, though. You better put it back.